My name is Clara, 33 years old, and my family thought they had finally destroyed me. At 3 in the morning, two police officers kicked down my apartment door with their guns drawn, shouting that I was under arrest for estate fraud and grand larceny. As they slammed me against the wall to handcuff me, I looked out into the hallway. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were standing there with satisfied smiles on their faces. My younger sister Brittany was holding up her phone, live streaming my arrest to her 3 million followers and calling me a thief. Her husband Jamal, an African-American real estate broker wearing a bespoke suit, leaned against the doorframe, arrogant and untouchable. He actually leaned over and whispered a joke to the arresting officer, and the cop laughed. They thought they had won. They thought I was just a helpless auditor they could easily destroy. What they did not know was that I was not a civilian, and the device strapped to my wrist was not a regular watch. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The sound of splintering wood is something you feel in your chest before your brain can process the danger. 1 second, I was fast asleep in my modest apartment, and the next, a deafening crash echoed through the hallway. Men in dark tactical gear flooded my living room. Flashlights cut through the darkness as I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Two uniformed police officers barged directly into my bedroom, their weapons pointed straight at my chest. They screamed at me to put my hands where they could see them, their voices overlapping in an intimidating roar. I did not scream. I did not panic. I calmly raised my empty hands and stepped slowly out of bed, keeping my movements entirely predictable. The taller officer grabbed me by the shoulder and spun me around, pressing my face hard against the cold drywall. "You are under arrest for estate fraud, grand larceny, and the manipulation of a vulnerable adult," he barked. He yanked my arms behind my back. "You have the right to remain silent." The heavy metal handcuffs bit into my wrists. I felt the sharp pinch of the steel tightening against my skin, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. I was highly trained to handle intensely stressful situations, though absolutely nobody in that room knew it. As the aggressive officers marched me into the brightly lit living room, I saw them waiting in the hallway. My family. They had actually coordinated this entire midnight spectacle. My mother Patricia stood near the broken doorway. She was wearing an expensive trench coat, her hair flawlessly styled for a 3 in the morning raid. She shook her head with a look of theatrical disappointment, sighing loudly so the arresting officers could hear. "I always knew you would end up like this, Clara," she said, her voice dripping with venom, masquerading as sorrow. "Stealing from your own flesh and blood. You are an absolute disgrace." My father Richard stood right beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at me not with parental concern, but with absolute triumph. He actually smiled at me, a cold, calculating grin that told me they had planned this execution down to the last minute. Then there was Brittany, my younger sister, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. She had her smartphone hoisted high in the air, the bright ring light illuminating my humiliation. She was broadcasting my arrest to her massive audience in real time, milking my tragedy for views. "Guys, I cannot believe this is happening right now." She feigned a dramatic sob, wiping away an invisible tear. "My own sister tried to steal our late grandfather's entire estate. Justice is finally being served tonight." Behind her stood Jamal, her husband. Jamal was an African-American real estate mogul who built his empire on shady property deals and untraceable offshore accounts. He looked completely unfazed by the chaos. As the officer pushed me toward the exit, Jamal leaned in and whispered something into the officer's ear. The cop chuckled, a conspiratorial laugh that confirmed the sick reality. Jamal had bought the local precinct, the corrupt judge who signed the warrant, and the narrative my family was eagerly selling. They were incredibly confident in their flawless plan. Grandfather Harrison had passed away just 2 weeks prior. He was the only person in this toxic family who ever showed me an ounce of genuine love. He also knew exactly how corrupt Jamal was and how heavily my parents were involved in his money laundering operations. Before he died, Grandfather Harrison and I had worked to secure his $15 million estate in an airtight legal trust, leaving every cent to me. When my parents and Jamal discovered they had been cut out, they used Jamal's dirty money to bribe local law enforcement, fabricating a story that I had forged the legal documents. They needed me locked in a jail cell and convicted of felony fraud so the state would invalidate the will. They thought I was just a struggling auditor who would crumble under a police interrogation and sign away my rights to avoid prison. I looked at Patricia and Richard. They were glowing with deep satisfaction. Now they were watching the police drag me away, believing they had won the ultimate prize. The officers shoved me toward the hallway. "Wait," I said, making my voice sound small and terrified. "Please, the handcuffs are too tight on my left wrist. It is cutting off my circulation." The officer scoffed, tightening his grip. "Deal with it," he muttered. But Jamal, playing the benevolent observer for Brittany's live stream, gestured to the cop. "Loosen it a fraction," Officer Jamal said smoothly. "We want to do things by the book." The officer grumbled, but stopped reaching down to adjust the metal cuff on my left wrist. It gave me exactly the 2 seconds of slack I needed. I did not cry. I did not beg for mercy. Instead, as the officer fumbled with the locking mechanism, I twisted my wrist just enough to reach the bulky smartwatch strapped to my arm. It looked like a generic fitness tracker. I pressed my thumb against a tiny concealed sensor on the side of the device. I flexed my wrist, applying pressure in a specific, deliberate sequence. One long press, 2 short taps. It was a silent distress beacon. The device did not beep. It did not flash. But beneath the matte black casing, a military-grade encrypted transmitter activated instantly. A silent, high-priority signal shot directly into a restricted federal database. My family thought they were sending a helpless civilian to a corrupt local jail to be bullied into submission. They had absolutely no idea that they had just authorized the kidnapping of a senior federal agent and that they had just triggered a massive federal response that was going to tear their entire world apart. The heavy metal door of the police cruiser slammed shut, sealing me inside the claustrophobic cage of the back seat. The smell of stale sweat and cheap coffee filled the cramped space. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort as the vehicle lurched forward, throwing my handcuffed wrists against the rigid divider. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark city streets, casting eerie shadows across the faces of the 2 officers in the front. They were completely silent, likely assuming I was too terrified to speak. They had no idea that the silence was exactly what I needed. It gave my mind the necessary space to process the intricate web of deception that had led to this exact moment. As I stared out the reinforced window at the passing streetlights, my thoughts drifted to Grandfather Harrison. He had passed away exactly 2 weeks ago. He was an incredibly sharp and perceptive man who built a massive logistics empire from the ground up. He was also the only member of my family who possessed a functioning moral compass. His estate was valued at $15 million a fortune, consisting of prime commercial properties, liquid assets, and offshore holding accounts. But Grandfather Harrison was not just wealthy. He was incredibly observant. He saw right through the polished facade of my family. He knew exactly what was hiding behind my parents' perfectly manicured suburban life and my sister Brittany's obnoxious social media empire. He knew about Jamal. Jamal had married into the family 5 years ago, presenting himself as an exceptionally successful luxury real estate broker. He drove imported cars, wore tailored suits, and threw dirty money around to buy my parents' absolute loyalty. But Grandfather Harrison and I knew the truth about his booming real estate business. It was nothing more than an elaborate front for a massive money laundering syndicate. Jamal was moving millions of dollars of illicit cash for organized crime networks, filtering the dirty money through shell companies and high-end property acquisitions. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were not just turning a blind eye. They were actively participating. They allowed Jamal to use their personal bank accounts and various consulting businesses to clean the cash, eagerly acting as financial mules in exchange for lavish vacations and a lifestyle they could never afford on their own. Grandfather Harrison refused to let his $15 million legacy be absorbed into a criminal enterprise. When his health began to fail, he called me to his estate for a highly confidential meeting. We sat in his study overlooking the gardens, and he handed me a stack of financial records that detailed my parents' sudden influx of untraceable cash. We knew what we had to do. Working with a trusted federal attorney, we completely restructured his estate. We created an ironclad bulletproof will that left every single asset exclusively to me. We established a blind trust that legally bypassed my parents and entirely locked out Jamal. We both knew the moment the will was read, my family would retaliate with brutal force. We just did not anticipate how far Jamal was willing to go to seize control of that $15 million. Jamal needed that estate. He needed the legitimate commercial properties my grandfather owned to wash a massive backlog of illegal funds. When the lawyer read the will last week, Jamal did not yell or threaten to sue. He simply smiled his arrogant smile and walked out of the room. I should have known he was activating a backup plan. Jamal used his illicit wealth to buy the local justice system. He funneled bribes to a corrupt county judge and paid off the local police department. They fabricated a completely fictitious narrative. They claimed that I had isolated a vulnerable dying man in his final days. They produced fraudulent documents stating that I had forced Grandfather Harrison to change his will under extreme duress. The narrative was perfect for my parents. It painted them as the grieving, victimized family, and painted me as the greedy, manipulative outcast who stole their rightful inheritance. They wanted to break me legally and financially, so I would surrender the estate just to make the nightmare stop. The cruiser hit a pothole, jarring my shoulders against the plastic seat and pulling me back to the present reality. We were approaching the downtown precinct. The streets grew quieter, the towering brick structure of the police headquarters looming ahead in the night. The officers up front finally spoke, exchanging a casual joke about where to grab breakfast after they finished booking the thief in the back. Their casual cruelty only solidified my resolve. They thought I was a terrified civilian whose life was currently falling apart. They did not realize that the federal distress signal I triggered back at the apartment was already pinging the local FBI field office and my superiors at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The cruiser turned sharply down an alleyway and descended into the secured underground parking garage of the precinct. The heavy security gate rolled shut behind us, locking me inside the belly of the corrupt department. The cruiser slowly rolled past a row of standard-issue police vehicles. Then something caught my eye, making the blood run cold in my veins. Parked directly in the spot reserved for the chief of police was a massive custom matte black luxury SUV. The customized license plate was unmistakable. It was Jamal's vehicle. He had not just followed the police transport. He had beaten us here. He was parking in the spot belonging to the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the building, treating the precinct like his own personal property. The implications were staggering. Jamal did not just have a few dirty cops on his payroll, he owned the entire building. The local precinct was completely in his pocket, and I was being delivered directly into his hands. The officers dragged me out of the cruiser and hauled me through the bleak concrete corridors of the police station. They did not take me to the standard booking desk where defendants usually surrender their personal items and receive a phone call. Instead, they marched me straight down a narrow, unlit hallway that bypassed the main processing area entirely. The heavy metal door of Interrogation Room 4 slammed shut behind me, echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. The room was freezing by design. It was a classic intimidation tactic meant to break down a suspect before the questioning even began. There were no windows, just 4 cinderblock walls painted a sickly shade of gray, and a single fluorescent bulb buzzing harshly overhead. I sat in the uncomfortable steel chair bolted to the floor. The handcuffs were still biting into my wrists, cutting off my circulation, but I kept my posture completely rigid. 2 detectives stormed into the room just moments later. They did not introduce themselves or state their badge numbers. The taller one, a man with a thick neck and a cheap suit, slammed a manila folder onto the scratched metal table between us. The second detective leaned against the closed door, crossing his arms and attempting to look menacing. The tall detective ripped a printed document from the folder and slid it across the table until it touched my bound hands. He slammed a plastic pen down right next to it. "Sign the paper, Clara," he demanded, his voice booming in the small room. "We know exactly what you did to your grandfather. We have sworn witness statements claiming you manipulated a dying man and forged his signature to steal $15 million. If you sign this confession right now and formally transfer the estate rights over to your sister Brittany and her husband Jamal, the district attorney is willing to be lenient. We can guarantee a reduced sentence of 10 years in a minimum security facility. If you refuse, we will make sure you get 30 years in a maximum security prison." It was the most blatantly corrupt shakedown I had ever witnessed in my entire law enforcement career. The detectives were not asking questions. They were not conducting an investigation. They were simply acting as armed debt collectors for my brother-in-law. They wanted me to sign away a federal informant estate to a money laundering syndicate. I did not reach for the pen. I did not utter a single word in response. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled. I let my silence fill the room, creating an uncomfortable vacuum that immediately threw the aggressive detectives off balance. The tall detective slammed his fist against the table, rattling the metal surface. "Did you hear me?" he shouted, leaning into my face, until I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You are going to prison for a very long time unless you cooperate." I kept my eyes fixed on the upper corner of the room. A small security camera was mounted near the ceiling, its red recording light blinking steadily in the dim illumination. I stared directly into the lens. The detectives assumed I was dissociating from fear. They had no idea I was actively communicating with my federal team. That blinking red light meant the precinct server was currently online. My encrypted distress signal had already penetrated their local network. My superiors at the bureau were sitting in a secure command center, watching everything these corrupt cops were doing to a federal agent. While maintaining my absolute silence, I clinically analyzed the two men holding me hostage. I noted their body language, the nervous twitch in the tall detective jaw, and the way the second officer kept checking his phone. They were anxious. They were rushing the process because they were following Jamal's strict timeline. I carefully examined their uniforms. Neither detective was wearing a body camera, which was a direct violation of state police protocol for a felony interrogation. They had also completely bypassed the reading of my Miranda rights on camera. Every single action they took was a massive violation of due process. They were handing me the exact ammunition I needed to tear this corrupt police department down to its foundation. The detectives were trying to trap me in an unbreakable box. What they failed to comprehend was that the box was actually a cage built for them. I was not trapped in this freezing room with two dirty cops. They were trapped in a highly monitored federal sting operation with me. "She is not going to talk," he muttered, pulling out his cell phone. "She thinks she is smarter than us. Bring them in. Maybe they can knock some sense into her before we throw her in lockup." The tall detective smirked and stepped back from the table, smoothing his cheap tie. "We tried to do this the easy way, Clara," he said mockingly. "Now we do it the hard way." The heavy lock on the metal door clicked open. What happened next defied every single procedural law in the criminal justice system. The two detectives actually stepped aside deferentially, bowing their heads like obedient servants. They opened the door wide to allow unauthorized civilians directly into an active police interrogation room. My toxic family strolled into the room as if they owned the entire police station. My father Richard and my mother Patricia walked in first, looking completely relaxed and victorious. My sister Brittany followed closely behind them, holding her smartphone up to record my humiliation. Jamal stepped through the doorway, fixing the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He looked at two detectives and gave them a slight nod of approval, dismissing them like hired help. The detectives quietly closed the door, leaving me entirely alone with the people who had just orchestrated my ruin. They believed they finally won this twisted little criminal game. My family immediately surrounded the scratched metal table, forming a suffocating wall of smug satisfaction and fake concern. Brittany shoved her smartphone right into my face, the bright light blinding me in the dim room. She was ensuring every angle of my defeat was perfectly captured for her loyal followers, playing the role of the traumatized sister to absolute perfection. Patricia placed her designer handbag on the floor and slumped into the empty metal chair across from me. She launched into a performance fully aware that the precinct security camera was recording her every move. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud theatrical sob that echoed off the cinderblock walls. "Just sign the confession, Clara." Patricia pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "We are your family. We will not let these detectives hurt you if you just give back what you stole from us. Do not drag our good name through the mud any longer. Please just do the right thing and sign the paper so we can all go home and put this horrible nightmare behind us." I stared at her, marveling at the sheer audacity of her performance. She wore a diamond necklace paid for by the enterprise I was currently dismantling. Richard stepped forward and slammed his palms against the table, crowding my physical space. There were no fake tears from him. His face was twisted in a snarl of genuine contempt, a look I had endured my entire life. He leaned down, his face flushed red. "You have always been a lifetime disappointment," Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You never measured up to your sister. You were a mediocre student, a pathetic struggling accountant, and now you have proven yourself to be a common thief. You took advantage of a sick, confused old man because you were too incompetent to build a successful life of your own. Sign the document now, or I will ensure the prosecutor pushes for the maximum sentence. You will rot in a concrete cell, and we will completely erase you from this family. You will be nothing." His words were designed to shatter me. For 33 years, that exact tone of voice had conditioned me to shrink, to apologize, to bend to their collective will. But tonight, his insults felt like absolutely nothing. I felt no pain, no sorrow, and no fear. I sat there perfectly composed, observing them like biological specimens. They were so blinded by their own greed that they could not see the steel trap closing tightly around them. Jamal had been standing near the door, silently watching the assault with supreme amusement. Now he decided it was time to close the deal. He stepped forward, waving his hand dismissively at my parents. Richard and Patricia instantly stepped back, yielding the floor to him like obedient servants. Jamal pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning across the table until his face was inches from mine. He smelled of expensive cologne and arrogance. He tapped the unsigned confession paper with his finger. "Let us cut the emotional nonsense," Clara, Jamal said smoothly, his voice dropping into a low, predatory murmur intended only for my ears. "You are a smart girl, mostly. You know exactly how the real world operates. The truth does not matter in this building. Power matters, money matters, and I have an unlimited supply of both." I kept my eyes locked onto his, refusing to look away or show a single ounce of intimidation. "I want you to understand exactly how trapped you are," Jamal continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You cannot fight me. I did not just hire a good lawyer, I bought this entire police department. Chief Donovan answers directly to me. I paid him enough cash to ensure any evidence you think you have will magically disappear from the evidence locker. The judge who signed your warrant just had his offshore mortgage paid off by my firm. They work for me. You have zero leverage here." Jamal leaned back slightly, admiring his own perceived brilliance. "If you sign this paper and hand over the estate, I will let you walk out of here with a slap on the wrist. But if you try to be a hero, I will systematically destroy you. I will freeze your bank accounts. I will completely ruin your credit. I will have your sad little auditor job terminated by sunrise. You will be a felon with no money, family, or future. I will lock you away forever, Clara. Now pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." The silence returned to the room, thick and suffocating. Brittany moved the camera closer, eager to capture the exact moment my spirit broke for her internet audience. Patricia sniffled loudly for effect, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. Richard glared at me with absolute hatred, waiting for my submission. Jamal simply smirked, waiting for his ultimate victory. I slowly shifted my posture, leaning forward against the metal table until I mirrored Jamal's position. The handcuffs rattled slightly against the cold steel surface. I took a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time since they had kicked down my apartment door hours ago, I finally opened my mouth to speak. My voice did not shake. It was not the meek, fearful tone they expected. It was surgical, calculating, and dangerously calm. "I have a question about your luxury real estate acquisitions, Jamal," I said softly, my eyes burning directly into his. "When you route the illicit cash through your shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, specifically using the routing number ending in 4829, do you genuinely believe the layer of cryptographic scrambling protects the origin of the funds? Or are you just completely unaware that the Federal Treasury monitors those exact sequential wire transfers?" The smug smile completely vanished from Jamal's arrogantly handsome face as he stared at me in total absolute silence. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. Jamal blinked, the muscles in his jaw ticking as his brain scrambled to process what I had just said. He leaned back, letting out a forced laugh that bounced off the concrete walls. He adjusted his expensive tie, trying to regain composure. "That is a cute trick, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "You spent hours digging through the old man's financial files and memorized a random string of numbers to sound smart. It is a lucky guess from a desperate accountant trying to act like a corporate mastermind. You think throwing financial jargon around will save you tonight." I maintained eye contact. I let his massive ego construct a lie to shield him from the terrifying reality. He needed to believe I was insignificant. My family's entire dynamic was built on the foundation of my supposed inferiority. I decided to weaponize that arrogance. "You are right, Jamal," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I am just a mediocre auditor. I am curious about one thing. If you are such a brilliant criminal mastermind, why did you entrust the delicate part of your offshore money laundering operation to these two?" I slowly shifted my gaze to Richard and Patricia. They could not even manage a simple mortgage without drowning in debt. "How did you expect them to funnel your cartel cash through Grandfather Harrison's legitimate business accounts without leaving a paper trail?" The insult hit its mark perfectly. My father, Richard, had a massive ego, and he hated being viewed as Jamal's subordinate. His face turned a deep shade of purple. He slammed his hand on the metal table, stepping aggressively in front of Jamal. "You shut your mouth, you ungrateful brat!" Richard shouted, his chest heaving with misplaced pride. "We did not need Jamal holding our hands for everything. We are the ones who figured out how to use the old man's accounts. While you were busy playing the devoted granddaughter sitting by his hospice bed reading books, your mother and I were the ones doing the real heavy lifting. We executed the transfers ourselves." Patricia stepped up beside him, unable to resist an opportunity to brag. She smoothed the lapels of her trench coat, looking down at me with absolute disdain. "We were brilliant, Clara." Patricia boasted, a sickening smile stretching across her face. "We funneled over $3 million of Jamal's cash directly through your grandfather's medical trusts while he was heavily medicated on morphine. We disguised every offshore transfer as specialized experimental overseas treatments and private charitable donations. We bypassed every federal tax flag, and the Internal Revenue Service never suspected a thing. You think you are the only one with a brain, but you are nothing compared to us. We secured our financial future while you cried." I sat perfectly still, letting their words hang in the freezing air of the interrogation room. They had freely confessed to massive federal tax fraud, elder financial abuse, and international money laundering entirely unprompted, simply because their fragile egos could not handle a mild insult from the daughter they despised. Brittany, completely oblivious to the catastrophic legal implications of what our parents had just confessed, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She adjusted her grip on her smartphone, panning the camera lens across the room to capture my face, then flipping it back to her own flawless makeup. "Did you guys hear that?" Brittany squealed into the microphone of her phone, addressing her 3 million loyal followers. She was giddy with the thrill of her own perceived victory. "My parents are literal geniuses, and my sister is just a jealous loser who tried to steal our rightful millions. We are about to be so incredibly rich, and she is about to spend the best years of her life wearing a bright orange jumpsuit in a dirty prison cell." Make sure you clip this and share it. Justice is beautiful. Jamal, however, was no longer smiling. The forced amusement had drained from his face. Unlike my superficial sister and arrogant parents, Jamal possessed the street smarts of a seasoned criminal. His eyes darted nervously around the windowless room, scanning the ceiling, the table, and finally locking onto my calm posture. The realization hit him like a physical blow. A sudden panic began to pool in his dark eyes. He lunged forward, grabbing the front of my shirt, pulling me halfway out of the metal chair. The handcuffs dug painfully into my wrists, but I did not flinch. He leaned in, his breath hot against my face, his voice trembling with sudden, violent rage. "You are wearing a wire." Jamal hissed, his eyes wide with paranoid fury as he frantically patted down my shoulders and the back of my chair. "You came in here trying to bait us. You think you are playing a game with me right now?" Richard and Patricia instantly froze, the smug smiles melting off their faces as Jamal's panic infected the room. Brittany lowered her phone slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. Jamal shoved me back into the chair and let out a breathless scoff, trying to regain his dominant posture. "It does not matter," Jamal declared, projecting a false sense of absolute confidence to steady his racing heart. "It does not matter if you have a recorder taped to your chest. We own this entire city. I pay the police chief. I pay the prosecutors. I own the district attorney. Even if you manage to record every word we just said, it means absolutely nothing. No local judge in this county will ever admit illegally obtained audio into a courtroom. I will have the evidence thrown out before the sun comes up. You are finished." I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache in my bruised wrists. I looked at Jamal, then at my parents, and finally at my sister. I let a genuine warm smile spread across my face. "Who said anything about local judges?" Jamal recoiled as if physically struck by my question. The sudden loss of control contorted his features into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. But his massive ego quickly overrode his survival instinct. He slammed his fist against the heavy metal door, the booming sound echoing violently through the sterile interrogation room. "Get in here right now," Jamal roared. The door flew open. The two corrupt detectives rushed back inside, awaiting their next order like obedient attack dogs. "Take her to the booking desk," Jamal commanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Process her immediately. Put her in the system as a hostile felon. I want her fingerprinted and thrown into the coldest holding cell. I want her completely broken by sunrise. Let us see how arrogant she acts when she is sharing a concrete floor with actual criminals." The tall detective did not hesitate. He lunged forward and grabbed me roughly by the upper arm, hauling me out of the metal chair. Pain shot through my shoulders as the handcuffs dug into my bruised wrists, but I kept my face impassive. I allowed them to drag me forward. Resistance was unnecessary. Every step they forced me to take toward the booking desk was a step deeper into the federal snare I had carefully laid for them. They marched me out of the freezing interrogation room and down the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway of the precinct. My family trailed closely behind us like a royal procession. Richard and Patricia walked with their heads held high, trying to maintain their smug, victorious facades. My question about the offshore routing numbers had clearly rattled them. Brittany followed at the rear, keeping her smartphone raised high. She was eagerly narrating my perpetrator walk to her live audience. She framed the shot, perfectly capturing the corrupt detectives shoving her own sister down the corridor. We emerged into the main processing area. It was an open room filled with battered desks and harsh overhead lighting. A tired-looking booking sergeant sat behind a raised glass reinforced counter. He looked up, surprised to see a civilian entourage marching into a restricted area. "Process her for felony fraud and grand larceny," the tall detective barked, shoving me against the booking counter. The sergeant frowned, glancing at Jamal, who had casually leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. The sergeant clearly understood the unspoken chain of command in this corrupt precinct. He did not ask to see the arrest report. He simply nodded and turned to his computer terminal, pulling up the state criminal database interface. Jamal stepped closer to the counter, his confidence returning as he watched. "This is the part where your life officially ends, Clara," Jamal whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Once your biometric data goes into the state system, you are marked forever. No bank will ever hire you. No landlord will ever rent to you. You are about to become a ghost. I stared straight ahead at the blank cinderblock wall. I knew exactly how the automated fingerprint identification system functioned. The local police network automatically pinged the state database, which then ran a cross-reference check against the National Federal Registry. Normally, this process took just a few seconds. But my biometric profile was not normal. My fingerprints were heavily encrypted under a Level 5 federal security clearance directly linked to the Department of the Treasury and the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The booking sergeant reached over the counter and grabbed my right hand. He dragged my hand toward the digital fingerprint scanner. The machine was a heavy black box. "Press your fingers down flat," the sergeant ordered. I extended my fingers, pressing them firmly against the cool glass surface. A bright green light swept back and forth beneath my skin. The machine hummed quietly, digesting my unique biometric markers. Behind me, my parents stepped closer to watch the final nail being driven into my coffin. Richard crossed his arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jamal. Brittany angled her camera to capture the computer screen, desperate to show her viewers the exact moment my criminal profile was generated. The scanner beeped a sharp, high-pitched sound, indicating the digital print capture was complete. On the sergeant's monitor, a gray progress bar appeared. The system was searching for a match. Any second now, Jamal mocked, tapping his expensive leather shoes against the linoleum floor. The progress bar hit 75%. The machine continued its low, rhythmic hum. I watched the reflection of the screen in the glass partition. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3 seconds passed. Suddenly, the low hum of the fingerprint scanner stopped dead. The gray progress bar on the sergeant's monitor completely froze. The sergeant clicked his mouse rapidly, but the cursor was entirely unresponsive. He mashed the keys on his keyboard, but the terminal had locked up completely. "What is wrong with it?" Jamal demanded, his voice sharp with sudden irritation. "Just print the damn summary." "I do not know," the sergeant muttered, hitting the escape key repeatedly. The whole network just froze up. Before the sergeant could reach for his desk phone to call technical support, a deafening, piercing alarm erupted from the speakers mounted in the ceiling. It was not a standard fire alarm. It was a high-frequency alternating siren designed to indicate a critical security breach. The sound was incredibly loud, echoing violently off the concrete walls and forcing my parents to cover their ears in shock. Then, every single computer monitor screen in the entire booking area went completely dark. The screens remained pitch black for 2 seconds. In unison, dozens of monitors across the room suddenly flashed a blinding, brilliant red. The standard police interface was completely gone. In its place, thick black letters blazed across every single screen in the room, displaying a message that made the corrupt detectives step back in absolute horror. "Classified. Restricted federal clearance required." The heavy steel of the handcuffs fell away, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp clatter. Chief Donovan backed away from me, his hands raised in a gesture of absolute surrender, sweat pouring down his flushed face in thick droplets. His chest heaved as if he had just run a marathon. He knew his career and his freedom had just evaporated. I slowly brought my arms forward, rolling my shoulders and rubbing the deep red indentations left on my wrists by the tight metal. The physical pain was entirely negligible compared to the profound satisfaction of this exact moment. I stood up straight. The timid, compliant auditor persona I had meticulously maintained for over a decade completely evaporated into the freezing air of the precinct. I let the false submissive posture drop. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin, and turned to face the people who shared my blood. The atmospheric shift in the room was instantaneous and suffocating. My family stared at me, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying transformation. The woman standing before them was no longer the punching bag they had systematically abused. The mask was gone. In its place stood cold, calculated federal authority. Patricia clutched her designer purse against her chest, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Richard took a faltering step backward, colliding with the edge of the booking counter. His arrogant sneer had been entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Brittany had finally lowered her smartphone, the screen going completely dark as the federal network lockdown severed her live broadcast. She looked around the freezing precinct, suddenly realizing that her internet fame offered zero protection in the real world. Jamal remained frozen near the cinderblock wall. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like a very expensive prison uniform. His eyes darted from the terrified Chief Donovan back to me, his criminal instincts finally catching up to his enormous ego. He opened his mouth to speak, attempting to summon his usual aggressive dominance, but the words died in his throat when I locked eyes with him. "I am not a struggling corporate auditor," I said, my voice echoing with absolute command through the silent local police station. "My name is Clara Harrison. I am a senior undercover agent for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, operating directly under the Department of the Treasury. For the past 36 months, I have been permanently attached to the Joint Federal Bureau of Investigation Anti-Money Laundering Task Force." The words struck them like physical blows. Richard let out a breathless gasp, his knees buckling slightly. Patricia grabbed his arm to steady herself, her eyes wide with mounting horror. Brittany looked frantically at Jamal, waiting for him to fix the situation, but Jamal was staring at me with the hollow, defeated look of a man who just realized he had walked willingly into his own execution. "You thought I was a pathetic failure because I drove a used car and lived in a modest apartment." I continued, stepping slowly toward the center of the room. "You thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. You mistook my silence for submission. But while you were aggressively mocking my modest lifestyle at every holiday dinner, I was meticulously mapping the entire infrastructure of your illegal empire. Every time you insulted my intelligence, I was actively downloading your encrypted financial ledgers. Every time you forced me to sit at the end of the table and listen to your bragging, I was cross-referencing your offshore shell companies with federal terror watch lists." I stopped just a few feet away from Jamal. His breathing had become rapid and shallow. "I know exactly how you move the money," Jamal, I stated, delivering the facts with surgical precision. "I know about the bogus luxury real estate appraisals you use to clean the cash. I know about the wire transfers you route through the Cayman Islands and the accounts you hold in Cyprus. I spent 3 years playing the role of your insignificant sister-in-law, enduring your endless disrespect solely to gain unrestricted physical access to your unencrypted home networks during family gatherings. You handed a federal agent the master keys to your criminal syndicate because your narcissism blinded you to any threat that did not wear a designer label." Jamal shook his head mechanically, a desperate animalistic denial taking over his features. "This is a bluff," he stammered, his voice cracking violently. "You are lying. You cannot prove any of this. I paid these cops. I bought this town." "You bought a local precinct, Jamal," I corrected him sharply. "I brought the entire federal government." I turned my attention back to my parents. They were trembling, the reality of decades in a federal penitentiary finally crushing their delusions of grandeur. Patricia reached out a shaking hand toward me, trying to summon the maternal authority she had weaponized against me for 33 years. "Clara, please," Patricia cried, her voice cracking. "We are your parents. We did not know what Jamal was really doing. We just wanted to secure the family legacy. We were trying to protect your grandfather from making a terrible financial mistake." "My grandfather," I repeated, letting a cold, merciless smile touch my lips. "You genuinely believe you outsmarted the man who built a logistics empire from nothing. You actually convinced yourselves that you successfully manipulated a dying man into signing away his fortune while he was lying in a hospice bed." Richard nodded frantically, desperate to cling to the narrative they had constructed. "He was confused, Clara. He did not know what he was doing with the estate. We had to intervene. We had to take control of the trust to save the money." I shook my head slowly, letting the final devastating piece of the puzzle fall perfectly into place. "Grandfather Harrison was never confused," I revealed, my words ringing out with absolute clarity. "And he was certainly never your victim." Grandfather Harrison was a highly classified federal informant. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world completely shattering. When he discovered you were using his legitimate logistics companies to filter Jamal illicit cash, he did not confront you, I explained, watching the blood drain completely from my father's face. He came directly to me. He willingly handed over 30 years of financial records to the federal government. He spent his final months on Earth actively wearing a wire during your visits, recording every single time you pressured him about the estate. He knew he was dying, and he chose to spend his last days helping me build the federal indictment against his own corrupt children. I took one final step forward, delivering the killing blow to their illusions. That $15 million will was not a mistake, and it was certainly not forged, I stated, my voice echoing with finality. It was a heavily monitored, federally sanctioned sting operation. We drafted that document specifically to force you out into the open. We knew you would resort to bribery, fraud, and extortion to claim the money. You did not trap me in this precinct tonight. You walked blindly into a federal snare that my grandfather and I built together, and the steel jaws just snapped shut. The sheer weight of that revelation crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogant delusions. The pristine, untouchable reality they had constructed for themselves was instantly pulverized into dust. Richard, the man who had spent his entire adult life projecting an image of absolute superiority and control, physically broke down. His legs simply gave out beneath his heavy frame. He collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor of the booking area, landing hard on his knees. The sharp impact echoed through the dead silence of the room, but he did not even seem to register the pain. His hands clawed uselessly at his own chest, his expensive suit wrinkling as he began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps tore from his throat. His face, previously flushed with aggressive rage, turned a sickening shade of gray. The towering patriarch, who had consistently belittled my intelligence and mocked my career, was reduced to a weeping, trembling mess, unable to draw a full breath as the realization of his impending federal incarceration suffocated him. Patricia stood frozen above him. She looked down at her husband writhing on the dirty precinct floor, but she made absolutely no move to comfort him. Her survival instinct, honed by decades of prioritizing her own comfort over everything else, was short-circuiting. She slowly backed away from Richard, her wide eyes darting frantically toward the heavy metal exit doors, as if she could somehow casually stroll out of the building and pretend none of this had ever occurred. Then the panic infected Brittany. My younger sister had been standing in the corner, clutching her smartphone like a protective talisman. The device had always been her shield, her weapon, and her entire source of validation. The moment my words fully registered in her mind, her eyes blew wide with terror. She stared down at the blank black screen of her expensive phone, suddenly realizing that her reckless live broadcast had permanently captured every single federal confession, every threat, and every piece of illegal bribery they had arrogantly flaunted in the interrogation room. Her perfectly manicured thumbs began flying across the glass screen in a frantic, desperate blur. She was desperately swiping, tapping, trying to access her application settings to delete the broadcast, erase the archives, and wipe her social media channels clean. "You cannot delete it, Brittany," I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the sound of our father sobbing on the floor. Brittany jerked her head up, her eyes wild with panic. "I am deleting everything right now," Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking as she jammed her finger against the screen. "You have nothing. I am wiping the whole account. The video is gone. It never happened." I took one slow, deliberate step toward her, letting my absolute federal authority radiate clearly through the freezing room. "Your phone is a useless piece of plastic," I informed her coldly. "The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network Cyber Division intercepted your transmission the exact second you pressed the live button in my apartment hallway. They did not just record the broadcast. They seized your entire cloud server an hour ago. Every deleted message, every hidden direct message regarding Jamal and his offshore accounts, every single piece of data you thought was secure, has already been downloaded, cataloged, and securely locked in a federal vault. You just provided the Department of Justice with highly incriminating digital evidence in pristine high definition." Brittany dropped the phone. It hit the concrete floor, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, high-pitched wail as her entire world completely evaporated. The absolute finality of my statement finally broke the spell holding Jamal in place. Jamal was a predator, a man who survived by always being one step ahead of the law and always having enough cash to buy his way out of a corner. But he was looking around a room where his money meant absolutely nothing. He looked at my father, hyperventilating on the floor. He looked at his wife, having a complete nervous breakdown over a shattered phone. He looked at me standing tall with the full weight of the federal government behind me. And then he looked at the heavy double doors leading out to the underground parking garage. The survival instinct of a cornered criminal completely took over. Jamal completely abandoned his careful bespoke elegance. He abandoned his wife and the in-laws who had sold their souls to serve him. He spun around, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished floor, and he sprinted directly for the precinct doors. He moved with explosive speed, a desperate, frantic dash for the exit. He clearly thought he could reach his luxury vehicle, smash through the security gate, and somehow outrun a federal dragnet. He thought the local officers standing frozen in the room would simply let him pass, just as they always had. "Stop right there," I commanded, my voice booming with authority. But I did not have to take a single step to pursue him. Chief Donovan instantly knew his entire law enforcement career was completely over. He knew he was facing severe federal obstruction charges, bribery, and corruption. He was a desperate, terrified man, looking for any possible way to mitigate the sheer wrath of the federal government crashing down upon his precinct. As Jamal sprinted past the counter, Donovan lunged. The heavy-set police chief threw his entire body weight directly at the fleeing real estate broker. Donovan collided with Jamal mid-stride. Both massive men went flying through the stagnant air, crashing violently into a heavy row of metal filing cabinets before slamming incredibly hard onto the unforgiving concrete floor. Jamal let out a sharp, agonizing cry of pain as the impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. Before Jamal could recover, Donovan scrambled on top of him. The police chief grabbed Jamal by the collar of his ruined suit, shoving his face forcefully into the dirty concrete. Donovan pressed his heavy knee squarely between Jamal's shoulder blades, pinning the struggling real estate broker flat against the grimy floor. The corrupt police chief practically ripped his own heavy steel handcuffs from his black utility belt and snapped them viciously onto Jamal's wrists. He ratcheted the metal teeth down so hard that Jamal yelled out in fresh, agonizing pain. Donovan was panting heavily, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes like a terrified dog, hoping for a treat after performing a parlor trick. He yelled out that the suspect was secured, trying frantically to play the role of a dedicated, honest public servant. He genuinely thought offering me Jamal on a silver platter would somehow miraculously erase the massive federal bribery charges hanging over his own head. Before I could even respond to his pathetic display of false loyalty, the distinct aggressive sound of heavy tires screeching against the asphalt echoed loudly from the street level, directly above the underground garage. The noise was absolutely massive, a synchronized fleet of heavy armored vehicles slamming their brakes in unison outside the main entrance. A split second later, the heavy reinforced glass doors of the main lobby were thrown wide open with explosive, undeniable force. Dozens of federal agents clad in dark tactical gear poured into the building like a highly coordinated, unstoppable avalanche. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their heavy tactical boots hitting the floor in a synchronized rhythm that shook the room. Emblazoned across their tactical vests in bold yellow letters were the initials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They immediately fanned out across the large booking area, securing every exit, every dark corridor, and every single room in the corrupt local precinct. A tall, broad-shouldered special agent in charge strode purposefully through the sea of tactical gear. He bypassed the local officers who were currently standing completely frozen with their hands raised high in the air. He walked directly toward me, halting at a perfectly respectful distance. He gave a sharp, highly professional nod. "The building is completely secured, Special Agent Harrison," he reported, his deep voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. The perimeter is locked down, and the cyber response team is currently extracting the local server drives to preserve the evidence. We await your orders. Hearing my true title spoken aloud in that corrupt precinct felt like breathing pure, clean oxygen. I stepped forward, taking absolute unchallenged command of the entire scene. The local detectives who had arrogantly tried to force my confession in the freezing interrogation room just moments ago were now backed completely against the cinder block wall. Their faces were completely drained of color as federal agents aimed tactical rifles squarely at their chests. I turned my attention to the booking sergeant and the corrupt detectives who had willingly participated in Jamal's illegal midnight shakedown. By the ultimate authority of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Department of Justice, I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal clear projection, every single local law enforcement officer in this room is hereby placed under strict federal arrest. You are in direct violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 1956 regarding the illicit facilitation of money laundering and Section 201 for the blatant acceptance of illegal bribes by public officials. The tall detective who had violently shoved me down the hallway earlier tried to open his mouth to protest the charges, but a federal agent instantly forced him hard against the wall, kicking his legs far apart. I walked slowly down the long line of disgraced officers. You engaged in a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy to illegally extort a federal agent and falsify legal documents to benefit a known money laundering syndicate. I told them, making sure my words carried the absolute crushing weight of a federal indictment. You sold your sacred badges to a criminal. Now you will surrender them permanently to the federal government. I loudly ordered the tactical agents to strip the corrupt officers of their weapons, their duty belts, and their badges. The metallic clatter of police shields hitting the concrete floor was a beautiful, resounding symphony of pure justice. Chief Donovan, still kneeling awkwardly beside the handcuffed Jamal, slowly raised his hands and let a federal agent confiscate his weapon without a single word of protest. His career was entirely over, and his pension was permanently gone. With the local police force fully neutralized and secured, I finally turned my attention back to my blood relatives. The federal agents had already hauled Richard and Patricia up from the floor, securing their wrists tightly behind their backs in heavy plastic zip ties. My parents looked completely shattered. The polished elite country club image they had aggressively maintained for decades had been violently ripped away. They were no longer untouchable suburban socialites looking down on everyone else. They were federal suspects, facing decades behind cold iron bars. Brittany was standing near the booking desk, quietly hyperventilating as a female agent searched her for additional concealed recording devices. Her expensive designer dress was deeply rumpled, and her flawless makeup was ruined by dark streaks of terrified tears. Jamal remained on the floor, his cheek pressed firmly against the dirty concrete, completely neutralized by the very justice system he arrogantly believed he owned just minutes ago. They had all conspired to completely destroy my life, steal my grandfather's legacy, and lock me in a concrete cell just to protect their illicit wealth. They had smiled and laughed while putting me in handcuffs, firmly believing I was nothing more than a pathetic, worthless obstacle standing in their path to unimaginable riches. Now the tables were entirely turned, and the absolute power of the federal government rested squarely in my hands. I looked at the family who had spent 33 years tearing me down. You wanted to celebrate your inheritance at the estate this morning. Let's not ruin the party. Throw them in the transports. Section 12, 1,000 words. The federal agents moved with aggressive precision. They hauled Jamal off the concrete floor, ignoring his groans as they dragged him out the back doors. Richard and Patricia followed, their wrists secured tightly behind their backs. The crisp morning air hit them as they were shoved into the back. Brittany was the last to be loaded, her ruined designer dress contrasting sharply with the prisoner transport. I watched the heavy doors slam shut, locking my family inside a rolling cage. I climbed into the passenger seat. The special agent in charge took the wheel. With a synchronized roar of heavy engines, our convoy pulled out of the underground garage and hit the city streets. The sun was just beginning to rise over the skyline, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. We drove in a tight formation, a procession of black federal vehicles cutting through the early morning traffic. Our destination was the sprawling $15 million Harrison estate, nestled in the most exclusive zip code in the state. During the silent ride, I thought about the sheer audacity of my mother. Patricia planned a lavish brunch for this morning. She disguised it as a celebration honoring the life of my grandfather, but everyone knew the truth. It was a victory party. She intended to use the event to publicly announce her hostile takeover of the estate and solidify her position at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. She ordered expensive caterers, imported champagne, and a live string quartet, completely certain that I would be rotting in a jail cell while she toasted to her new fortune. As our convoy approached the winding private road leading to the estate, the absurd reality of the premature celebration came into full view. The massive wrought iron gates were wide open, flanked by hired valets in crisp white shirts. A line of expensive sports cars and luxury sedans stretched down the driveway. The elite socialites of the city had arrived early, eager to drink free champagne and gossip about the newly wealthy heirs. Through the tinted windows of the SUV, I could see the expansive front lawn. White event tents were pitched perfectly across the green grass. Waitstaff carried heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes and expensive appetizers. The gentle, sophisticated melodies of a string quartet floated through the morning air. Women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits stood in small, exclusive clusters, laughing and chatting. They were waiting for the guests of honor to arrive. They expected my parents to pull up in the luxury vehicle ready to pop champagne. Instead, the tranquil atmosphere was violently shattered. The special agent in charge hit the emergency sirens for 2 deafening seconds to clear the path. Our convoy of heavy black SUVs and armored federal transport vans tore up the pristine gravel driveway, completely bypassing the startled valets. We slammed on the brakes directly in front of the grand marble staircase of the main house. The sudden aggressive arrival of a federal raid team instantly killed the party. The string quartet stopped playing mid-song. Crystal champagne flutes slipped from manicured hands, shattering against the stone pathways. The wealthy guests stood absolutely frozen, their polite smiles melting into expressions of sheer, unadulterated shock. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents poured out of the SUVs, instantly establishing a secure perimeter around the vehicles. The high society crowd gasped, taking involuntary steps backward as tactical rifles were raised. Then the heavy metal doors of the prisoner transport vans swung open. The federal agents reached inside and forcefully pulled the guests of honor out into the bright morning sunlight. The spectacle was utterly devastating to their manufactured social image. Richard was dragged out. First, his shoulders slumped and his face completely devoid of color. The arrogant patriarch looked like a broken, pathetic old man. Patricia stumbled out next, weeping uncontrollably. Her flawless hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive trench coat was stained with the grime of the precinct floor. She desperately tried to hide her face from her wealthy friends, deeply humiliated that her country club peers were watching her being treated like a common criminal. Brittany was hauled out, kicking and crying, her ruined makeup making her look absolutely unhinged. She frantically tried to turn away from the dozens of people staring at her, fully aware that the very socialites she desperately wanted to impress were now viewing her as a massive disgrace. Finally, the agents pulled Jamal out of the back. The once untouchable real estate mogul was limping heavily, his bespoke suit torn at the shoulder from his encounter with the corrupt police chief. The heavy plastic zip ties binding his wrists behind his back served as visual confirmation of his defeat. The wealthy crowd began to quietly murmur. These were the exact people who had spent years mocking me behind my back, fueled by the vicious lies my family had spread to build themselves up. They had eagerly consumed the narrative that I was a pathetic failure. They had laughed at my modest lifestyle, completely oblivious that they were socializing with common criminals, stealing from a dying man. Now they were witnessing the brutal destruction of the lies they had chosen to believe. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt. I reached into the center console, picked up my gold federal badge, and clipped it to the front of my belt. I opened the door of the SUV and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sun caught the polished gold of my badge, making it gleam brightly. I did not rush. I walked slowly and purposefully toward the marble staircase, my posture radiating federal authority. As I approached the socialites, they recognized the face of the daughter they had been taught to despise. They saw the federal badge. They saw the tactical agents deferring to my command. The crowd of guests parted for me in absolute silence, stepping aside to clear my path like the Red Sea. I ascended the granite staircase, my boots echoing against the stone. I reached the landing and turned to face the sprawling lawn. The catering staff stood frozen, holding silver trays. The wealthy elite of the city, the very people who had sneered at my supposedly mediocre existence, stared up at me with pale faces. Below me, federal agents forced Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal into a tight line at the base of the steps. They looked like shattered porcelain. I reached into my tactical vest and pulled out a thick master file. It contained hundreds of pages of federal indictments, financial transcripts, and wiretap logs. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. Anger implies a loss of control, and right now I held absolute authority. My voice carried across the silent estate, surgical and deadly calm, cutting through the crisp morning air with devastating precision. "Welcome to the celebration!" I announced clearly to the completely silent crowd. "Patricia invited you all here to toast to a stolen legacy. You came to drink champagne funded by the exploitation of my dying grandfather. Since you are already gathered, it is only fitting that you witness exactly where the money originates." I opened the master file and locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. He tried to stand tall, trying to project the intimidating aura of a successful real estate mogul, but the heavy plastic zip ties biting into his wrists ruined the illusion. "Jamal operates a luxury real estate brokerage downtown," I stated clearly, ensuring every socialite on the lawn heard every single syllable. "You all know him. Many of you have bought homes through his firm. You admired his imported cars and bespoke suits. What you did not know is that his brokerage is nothing more than a high-volume washing machine for organized crime syndicates operating on the eastern seaboard." Jamal forcefully shook his head, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow. He looked frantically at the guests, attempting to salvage his destroyed reputation. "Do not listen to her!" he shouted, his voice cracking violently. "This is a targeted setup. She is lying to all of you." I ignored his pathetic outburst and flipped to the first page of the indictment. I read the facts directly from the federal record. "You create fictitious buyers using stolen identities," I explained, my voice relentless and steady. "You use dirty street money to purchase high-end commercial properties entirely in cash. Then you immediately sell those same properties at a deliberate loss to shell corporations that you personally control. The funds are then wired out as legitimate real estate proceeds, allowing violent criminal enterprises to access clean capital without triggering domestic banking alarms." I stepped down one marble stair, closing the distance between us. The federal agents tightened their grip on his shoulders as he tried to back away. "You thought you were a genius, Jamal." I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp clinical register. "You thought layering the transactions through multiple holding companies would hide the origin of the funds. But you made a critical error. You used the exact same offshore routing protocols for every single transaction. You thought your accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely untraceable. You genuinely believed that routing number ending in 4829 was protected by unbreakable encryption." Jamal gasped, his chest heaving rapidly. The exact routing number I had whispered to him in the freezing interrogation room earlier that morning was now being broadcast to the entire elite social circle. He realized I had not just guessed. I possessed the entire master ledger of his massive criminal enterprise. "We have tracked every single wire transfer," I told him, closing the thick file with a loud snap. "We tracked the $3 million you forced my parents to funnel through Grandfather Harrison's medical trusts. We tracked the massive bribes you paid to the local police chief to secure your fake arrest warrant. We seized the server data from your shell company, proving you actively laundered over $50 million in the past 36 months alone. You left a digital footprint so massive that the Department of Justice built an entire task force just to catalog your mistakes." The guests gasped collectively. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men who had done business with Jamal took immediate steps backward, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from a massive federal target. They realized their own finances might now be subject to invasive federal audits simply for associating with him. The social destruction was final and completely irreversible. Faced with decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, Jamal's criminal survival instincts kicked into overdrive. His arrogant facade completely shattered, replaced by the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. He thrashed against the federal agents holding him, his eyes wild and bloodshot, as he scanned the heavily armed perimeter. "You cannot legally touch me!" Jamal screamed, spitting the words out in a panicked frenzy. "You cannot arrest me for international wires. I am heavily protected. I have an official diplomatic attachment to the Cypriot consulate. I am a registered financial attaché. You do not have the legal jurisdiction to hold me. I have absolute diplomatic immunity." He was grasping at straws, attempting to invoke a fraudulent overseas connection he had purchased years ago through a corrupt foreign official. He truly thought the bureaucratic red tape of international law would force the federal agents to uncouple his handcuffs and let him walk away right there on the grass. I stared down at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I let his desperate claim hang in the air for a few seconds, allowing him to taste the false hope of a miraculous escape. Then I crushed it effortlessly. I smiled, shaking my head slowly. "Did you really think the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network would execute a raid of this magnitude without securing the international perimeter first?" I asked softly, stepping down until I was directly at his eye level. "We visited your overseas contacts yesterday." Jamal stopped thrashing. He froze completely, staring up at me with sheer terror. "Your untouchable contacts at the consulate are currently sitting in federal holding cells," I revealed, delivering the final devastating blow. "The moment we showed them the wiretap transcripts detailing your operation, they rolled on you instantly. They gave up your name, your account numbers, and your entire network just to secure their own plea deals. Your diplomatic immunity does not exist, Jamal. Your friends sold you out to the federal government to save themselves, and you are entirely on your own." The absolute reality of his isolation finally broke Jamal. The smooth real estate broker vanished, leaving a terrified man staring at the ruins of his life. Faced with spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary, the legendary loyalty of my family instantly evaporated. They turned on each other with the viciousness of starved wolves. Brittany was the first to break the alliance. The golden child who just hours ago had been enthusiastically live-streaming my arrest to millions of followers suddenly realized she was facing a federal conspiracy charge. She yanked her shoulder away from the agent holding her and glared at her husband. "I had absolutely nothing to do with his business," Brittany screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the lawn. "I am just a social media influencer. I do not know anything about offshore accounts or money laundering." Jamal lied to me. He told me his real estate firm was highly profitable. "I am an innocent victim. You need to let me go right now." Jamal whipped his head around, staring at his wife with sheer disbelief. The betrayal hit him fast, and his shock immediately morphed into explosive anger. He thrashed against his plastic zip ties, leaning aggressively toward Brittany and my parents. "You spoiled, pathetic liar!" Jamal roared, his voice cracking with rage. "You spent every dime I brought home. You knew exactly where the cash came from. And do not act innocent, Richard. You and Patricia forged the hospice documents. I just gave you the outline. You two sat in the hospital room and forced the old man to sign the fake amendments. You orchestrated the estate fraud because you were desperate to pay off the massive credit card debt you hid from your country club friends." The high society guests gasped in unison. The elite crowd who had spent years admiring my parents' perfect suburban facade now watched in absolute disgust as the ugly criminal truth was laid bare on the front lawn. Richard and Patricia turned pale, their mouths opening and closing in silent panic. "That is a complete fabrication," Richard yelled, his voice trembling as he tried to maintain his shattered dignity in front of his peers. "We are respectable citizens. Jamal is a criminal trying to drag us down with him." I watched them tear each other apart, feeling a profound sense of vindication. The toxic family unit that banded together for 33 years to isolate and abuse me was completely destroying itself to save their own skins. They had no loyalty, they only had greed and self-preservation. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Brittany. She shrank back, her eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape that did not exist. The golden child was finally forced to face the sister she had systematically bullied her entire life. "You claim you are an innocent victim, Brittany," I stated, my voice echoing with icy federal authority. "You claim your lifestyle is completely separate from Jamal and his illicit activities. Let us closely examine that claim right now before your audience of wealthy peers." I opened the thick master file again and pulled out a stack of financial flowcharts, holding them up for both Brittany and her wealthy audience to see. "Your entire online persona is a carefully constructed federal crime," I explained clinically. "You portray yourself as a self-made millionaire influencer. But we audited your holding companies. Your cosmetic line has never generated a single dollar of actual profit. Every luxury handbag, every first-class flight, and every designer outfit you flaunted was directly funded by wire fraud." Brittany shook her head frantically, fresh tears ruining her expensive makeup. She tried to look away, but the federal agents held her firmly in place. "Jamal used your vanity brand as a primary washing machine for cartel money," I continued relentlessly. "He deposited hundreds of thousands of dollars in dirty cash into your business accounts, classifying them as phantom brand sponsorships. You knowingly signed the tax returns verifying those deposits. You did not build a business, Brittany. You built a federal money laundering vehicle disguised as an Instagram aesthetic, and you completely knew it. We intercepted the encrypted messages where you explicitly asked Jamal for an extra $50,000 of untraceable cash to pay for your luxury vehicle." The crowd of socialites began muttering harshly. The same people who eagerly followed Brittany online and attended her exclusive parties were now looking at her with absolute revulsion. Her fake empire had been burned to the ground in less than 2 minutes. She was no longer a wealthy influencer. She was an indicted co-conspirator facing serious prison time. Brittany let out a loud, pathetic wail and slumped forward against the agent, holding her completely broken. The golden child had finally fallen. With Jamal neutralized and Brittany destroyed, the focus shifted to the architects of this entire nightmare. I slowly turned my gaze toward my parents. Richard was staring at the grass, completely defeated, realizing his respected social standing was permanently gone. But Patricia was not ready to surrender. Her survival instinct kicked into overdrive, prompting her to play the absolute final, most desperate card she had left. Patricia suddenly threw herself forward, her knees hitting the stone pathway hard. The federal agents tried to restrain her, but she aggressively wriggled forward, pulling herself across the ground until she was just a few feet away from my boots. Her expensive dress dragged through the dirt. She looked up at me, her face completely covered in tears, her eyes wide with a frantic, manufactured agony. She knew the legal arguments had failed. She knew the financial evidence was absolutely undeniable. So she resorted to the only weapon she had ever successfully used. "Clara, my sweet girl," Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking with a perfectly orchestrated display of maternal desperation. "Please, you have to listen to me. We are your blood. We are your parents." I stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. Patricia knelt on the manicured grass of the sprawling estate, her expensive silk dress soaking up the morning dew and the dirt. She clasped her hands together tightly against her chest, performing a masterclass in theatrical desperation. She wailed loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the lawn to reach the ears of her wealthy country club friends. "We sacrificed everything for you, Clara," Patricia cried, her tone fluctuating between a demanding shriek and a pathetic whimper. "We gave you a roof over your head. We clothed you. We protected you from the harsh realities of the world. You cannot let these federal agents take us away. We are your blood. You owe us your loyalty." A heavy, absolute silence fell over the gathered crowd of high society guests. The catering staff stood perfectly still. The tactical agents surrounding the perimeter kept their rifles lowered, but their eyes remained highly alert watching the pathetic display unfold. A few years ago, that exact tone of voice would have paralyzed me. When I was a teenager, Patricia would use those exact same tears to guilt me into surrendering my allowance, to force me to apologize for things I never did, and to make me believe I was an ungrateful burden on the family. She expected the heavy chains of familial obligation to miraculously pull me back under her control. She expected me to break down, rush forward, and order the federal agents to release my parents. Instead, I stood perfectly rigid on the marble staircase. I did not soften my gaze. I did not extend a hand to comfort her. I let her weep on the ground for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the elite guest to fully witness the absolute humiliation of a woman who had spent decades pretending to be royalty. "You sacrificed absolutely nothing for me," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that sliced right through her manufactured sobbing. "You utilized my existence purely as a financial shield to protect your own reckless spending. You claim you are my blood, but you treated my future like a disposable bank account to fund a lifestyle you could never legitimately afford." Patricia aggressively shook her head, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheeks. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her eyes darting frantically toward her wealthy friends desperate to salvage her destroyed social standing. "We gave you everything. We struggled so hard to provide for this family. We did what we had to do to survive." I slowly reached into the thick master file I held in my hands. I bypassed the federal indictments regarding the money laundering syndicate and pulled out a single neatly printed banking manifest from over a decade ago. I held the document up, letting the morning sun illuminate the stark, undeniable proof of her betrayal. "You want to talk about survival?" I asked, my voice dropping to a clinical, razor-sharp register. "Let us discuss the concept of survival. Let us talk about August 12th, exactly 9 years ago. You walked into the First National Bank branch on Main Street. You approached the teller at 2:15 in the afternoon. You signed a withdrawal slip using your authority as my legal guardian, and you completely emptied a high-yield savings account that Grandfather Harrison had established exclusively for my college tuition." Patricia froze. The theatrical tears instantly stopped flowing. Her breath hitched in her throat as the realization hit her. She thought that account had been successfully buried and forgotten. She had no idea the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network possessed the forensic accounting capability to trace a decade-old transaction down to the exact second. "You withdrew exactly $62,450. I continued reading the precise figures directly from the federal transcript. That was the exact amount I needed to secure my enrollment at the university. That was the money Grandfather Harrison set aside to guarantee I would have a successful, independent life. But you did not withdraw those funds to help me. 2 days later, on August 14th, you authorized a direct wire transfer of that exact same amount to a luxury imported car dealership in the financial district." I turned my gaze slightly toward Jamal, who was currently being held firmly by two heavily armed agents. "You stole your own daughter's college tuition to cover Jamal's massive underground gambling debts and to secure the down payment on his imported Porsche," I revealed, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the estate lawn. "You literally handed my future to a criminal just so you could maintain the illusion of wealth. You forced me to take out crippling student loans. You forced me to work 80-hour weeks at a miserable corporate job while you paraded around the city in a luxury vehicle paid for with my stolen education fund." The socialites gasped in unison. A wealthy woman in a designer hat actually covered her mouth in sheer horror. The crowd began to murmur in absolute disgust, stepping even further away from the disgraced family. Stealing from a federal government entity was one thing, but stealing a child's education fund to buy a sports car for a criminal son-in-law violated the deepest moral codes of the community. Patricia looked around at her peers, seeing the absolute revulsion in their eyes. She realized her social execution was now entirely complete. "Your love died the day you sold my future for a down payment on his Porsche," I told her, delivering the fatal emotional blow without a single ounce of hesitation. "You are not crying because you love me. You are crying because you are broke. You are crying because the federal government is going to seize every single asset you possess, and you know you will never set foot in a country club again. Patricia slumped forward into the dirt, letting out a hollow, defeated wail. She had absolutely no defense left. Every lie she ever told had been surgically dismantled. Richard could not handle the absolute humiliation. The fragile ego of the towering patriarch completely shattered. He had spent his entire life dominating women, bullying his daughters, and demanding total obedience from everyone around him. Seeing his wife humiliated in the dirt and his own legacy destroyed by the daughter he deemed a failure was simply too much for his mind to process. He completely snapped. Richard let out a furious, animalistic roar. He violently jerked his shoulders, attempting to break free from the federal agent holding his arms. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He ignored the federal rifles. He ignored the reality of his situation. He aggressively lunged forward toward the marble staircase, intending to physically intimidate me one last time, desperately trying to reassert his dominance by sheer force. "You ungrateful, disrespectful little brat!" Richard bellowed, his heavy boots tearing up the manicured grass as he charged forward. "I will teach you how to speak to your family." He did not even make it 2 steps. The federal response was instantaneous and merciless. The FBI agent standing nearest to the staircase did not hesitate. He immediately drew his yellow taser aimed squarely at Richard's chest and pulled the trigger. The loud, sharp crack of the electrical discharge echoed across the lawn. The twin prongs struck Richard directly in the torso. A massive surge of electricity coursed through his body. His furious roar instantly transformed into a strangled gasp as his muscles completely locked up. The towering, arrogant patriarch became completely rigid before toppling forward like a felled tree, crashing face first into the dirt directly beside his sobbing wife. Richard groaned, his cheek pressed against the damp soil, his body twitching uncontrollably from the electrical current. He looked absolutely pathetic, completely stripped of every ounce of the terrifying authority he had wielded over me since childhood. Patricia shrieked, scrambling away from him in sheer terror, her hands covered in mud. The remaining federal agents quickly swarmed the fallen patriarch, flipping him onto his stomach and securing his wrists with heavy industrial zip ties. He did not possess the strength to resist anymore. His massive ego had been physically and legally dismantled in front of the entire neighborhood. I stood on the marble steps, looking down at the 4 individuals who had made it their life mission to destroy me. Jamal was completely silent, his eyes locked on the grass, rapidly calculating exactly how many decades he would spend behind bars. Brittany was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the terrifying reality of federal prison stripped away her influencer facade. Patricia was weeping into her dirty hands, aggressively mourning the loss of her credit cards and country club memberships. Richard lay paralyzed in the dirt. I turned to the special agent in charge, who was standing ready beside the lead transport van. "Process them all," I commanded, my voice carrying crisp and clear over the manicured lawn. "Execute the federal warrants for money laundering, wire fraud, extortion, and the bribery of public officials. Load them into the transports." The federal agents moved with aggressive, synchronized precision. They hauled Richard to his feet, ignoring his groans of pain. They grabbed Patricia by the arms, dragging her away from the center of the lawn. As they marched my family toward the waiting armored vehicles, the lead FBI agent began to loudly recite the words that would officially mark the end of their freedom. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent announced, his authoritative voice echoing against the stone facade of the estate. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The iconic warning. Something my family had only ever heard on television programs, from the comfort of their expensive leather sofas, was now their living nightmare. They were no longer the untouchable elite. They were federal suspects, completely stripped of their agency, their dignity, and their power. The high society guests, the very people my parents had desperately tried to impress with their stolen wealth, did not look away out of respect. They did the exact opposite. Dozens of wealthy socialites pulled out their expensive smartphones. The bright morning sun caught the glare of camera lenses as they actively filmed the brutal downfall of Richard and Patricia. These were the people who had attended my parents' lavish dinner parties, drank their imported wine, and eagerly participated in mocking my supposedly mundane existence. Now they were documenting the absolute destruction of their former friends, eager to share the scandalous footage with their exclusive social circles. Brittany noticed the cameras pointing at her. The golden child who had built an entire career on broadcasting a fake, luxurious life tried to hide her tear-streaked face from the lenses. She twisted her shoulders, attempting to shield her ruined designer dress from the digital scrutiny, but the federal agents held her firmly in place. She was experiencing the ultimate crushing irony. Her catastrophic downfall was being live-streamed by her own peers. The situation escalated even further as a deafening wall of sound erupted from the main road. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate, which the federal convoy had left wide open, were suddenly flooded with blinding flashes of light. The local media had arrived. News vans from every major network in the city screeched to a halt right outside the property line. Reporters clutching microphones sprinted toward the perimeter, followed closely by camera crews carrying heavy broadcasting equipment. News helicopters began circling overhead, the rhythmic thumping of their rotor blades shaking the leaves of the old oak trees. The story of a massive federal raid targeting a prominent local real estate broker and his elite family had leaked to the press desk. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut as the camera flashes illuminated his face. He knew his picture would be plastered across every evening news broadcast in the country by 5 o'clock. The secret criminal empire he had built in the shadows was completely exposed to the glaring light of national media. The agents shoved Jamal into the back of the first armored transport van. Brittany was forced into the second vehicle, her wails echoing from the steel interior. Patricia and Richard were loaded into the final transport. My mother turned her head one last time, trying to look back at the beautiful, sprawling estate she had wrongfully tried to claim. A federal agent firmly pushed her head down, forcing her into the dark, windowless cage of the van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a resounding final thud. The engines of the federal transports roared to life, spewing gray exhaust into the pristine morning air. The special agent in charge gave me a sharp, respectful salute before climbing into the lead vehicle. The massive convoy began to slowly roll down the long gravel driveway, their red and blue emergency lights flashing brilliantly against the manicured hedges. The reporters waiting at the gates aggressively shouted questions, their camera lenses pressed against the iron bars, capturing the dramatic exit of the fallen elite. I watched the black vehicles disappear down the winding road, taking the architects of my misery completely out of my life. The screaming sirens gradually faded into the distance, eventually swallowed by the ambient sounds of the waking city. The high society guests standing on the lawn were completely silent. The string quartet had long since packed up their instruments and fled the scene. The catering staff quietly began clearing the shattered crystal champagne flutes from the stone pathways. The wealthy elite realized the spectacular show was officially over. Without exchanging a single word with me, they hurriedly walked toward their luxury cars, eager to escape the radioactive blast zone of a major federal crime scene. Within minutes, the sprawling front lawn was completely empty. I stood entirely alone on the grand marble staircase of Grandfather Harrison's $15 million estate. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer bound by heavy steel handcuffs. They were no longer tied down by the toxic, crushing expectations of a family that only viewed me as an object to be exploited and discarded. I took a slow, deep breath. The crisp, clean morning air filled my lungs, tasting sweeter than anything I had ever experienced. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had rested on my shoulders for 33 years was completely gone. I unclipped the gold federal badge from my belt and held it in my palm, feeling the cool, solid weight of the authority I had earned through sheer resilience and absolute dedication. The terrifying nightmare was completely over. The corrupt police officers were being dismantled. The money laundering syndicate was destroyed. The people who had tried to lock me in a concrete cell were now heading to one themselves. I turned around and looked up at the magnificent facade of the estate. It was no longer a symbol of my family's greed. It was the foundation of my new empire. The cleanup begins now. 6 months passed with the relentless grinding efficiency of the federal justice system. The grand jury indictments dropped like a succession of heavy iron vaults. I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle, watching the architects of my misery face the absolute consequences of their arrogance. Jamal stood before the federal judge, his bespoke suits permanently replaced by an oversized bright orange jumpsuit. The swaggering real estate mogul was entirely gone. The Department of Justice hit him with a devastating barrage of racketeer-influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act charges. The evidence we had collected from the estate sting, combined with the server data seized from his shell companies, created an inescapable labyrinth of guilt. The judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. He dismantled Jamal's fraudulent empire piece by piece, stripping him of all his assets before delivering the final blow. Jamal was sentenced to 20 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He did not look back as the armed marshals led him away in heavy chains. He simply stared at the floor, a completely broken man who finally realized his dirty money could not buy the federal government. Brittany fared no better. The golden child stood trembling at the defense table, clutching a crumpled tissue. She desperately tried to play the role of the naive, manipulated influencer, sobbing loudly for the judge and claiming she had absolutely no idea how her cosmetic empire was funded. The federal prosecutor immediately dismantled her pathetic performance by projecting her encrypted text messages onto the massive courtroom screens. The messages explicitly showed her demanding washed cash to fund her luxury lifestyle, confirming her active role in the syndicate. The judge was visibly disgusted by her profound lack of accountability. Brittany was convicted of criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, sentencing her to 5 years in a federal correctional institution. Her theatrical tears turned into genuine hyperventilating shrieks as female bailiffs secured her wrists and escorted her out of the courtroom. Her 3 million online followers were completely gone, replaced by a harsh reality of concrete walls, steel bars, and strictly scheduled yard time. The swift and brutal convictions were largely made possible by the ultimate betrayal from within their own ranks. Chief Donovan, absolutely desperate to avoid spending the rest of his life in a federal prison cell for accepting illegal bribes, took a highly restrictive plea deal. The disgraced former police chief took the witness stand wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He sang like a canary, explicitly detailing every single illegal payment Jamal had ever made to the local precinct. Donovan completely surrendered his badge, his state pension, and his dignity, willingly becoming the star witness that drove the final nail into Jamal and Brittany's legal coffins. Richard and Patricia managed to narrowly avoid federal prison, but their physical freedom came at a catastrophic cost. Faced with overwhelming, undeniable evidence of their participation in the money laundering network and the attempted estate fraud, my parents chose the path of ultimate cowardice. They fully cooperated with the federal investigators, eagerly turning over every single piece of financial data they possessed to save their own skins. They happily traded their loyalty to Jamal for their ability to sleep in their own beds. However, avoiding a jail cell did not mean escaping punishment. The Department of the Treasury unleashed the full, devastating power of massive civil asset forfeiture. Because they had actively utilized their personal accounts and properties to funnel illicit cash, the federal government legally designated all of their wealth as the proceeds of criminal activity. I stood quietly on the sidewalk across from their sprawling suburban mansion and watched the execution of the seizure warrants. It was a methodical, clinical dismantling of their entire superficial lives. Federal agents marched out of the grand front doors carrying heavy boxes of financial records, seized jewelry, and valuable artwork. Heavy tow trucks backed into the wide driveway, aggressively hooking up Richard's prized imported sedans and Patricia's luxury SUV. The vehicles were hauled away to federal impound lots, leaving stark, empty tire tracks on the pristine pavement. The absolute destruction of their wealth did not stop at their manicured driveway. The government froze every single bank account tied to their names. Their retirement portfolios, their investment accounts, and their hidden emergency funds were completely seized pending the final criminal investigation. The platinum credit cards in Patricia's designer purse were instantly transformed into useless pieces of plastic. The federal bank officially foreclosed on the mansion itself, placing heavy iron padlocks on the custom mahogany front doors and plastering bright red federal seizure notices across the massive front windows. Richard and Patricia were abruptly forced out onto the curb by armed agents. They were permitted to take only 2 large trash bags filled with basic non-designer clothing. They stood on the sidewalk entirely stripped of the wealth and status that had defined their entire existence. The towering patriarch and the elite socialite had absolutely nothing left to their names. No house, no cars, no cash, no legacy. In a desperate bid for survival, Patricia pulled out her cell phone, frantically calling the wealthy country club friends she had spent decades trying to impress. She begged for a place to stay, a temporary loan, or just a guest house to sleep in for a few nights. But the elite social circle they had worshipped had already watched their spectacular, humiliating downfall on the evening news. The rejection was swift and absolute. Former friends hung up the phone immediately. Neighbors who used to attend their lavish dinner parties now quickly pulled their curtains shut and locked their heavy doors, treating my parents like toxic, radioactive pariahs. No one wanted to be associated with disgraced federal suspects. No one offered a single dime of charity. Richard and Patricia were left standing entirely alone on the edge of the street, clutching black garbage bags containing all their worldly possessions, as the cold sun set over the affluent neighborhood that had permanently expelled them. The cold sun setting over that affluent neighborhood was the absolute last glimpse of luxury Richard and Patricia would ever experience. Stripped of their stolen wealth and permanently exiled from high society, my parents were violently forced into a reality they had spent their entire lives mocking. They ended up in a decrepit, rusting trailer park located in the most dangerous industrial sector of the city. Their new home was a cramped, decaying tin box that smelled permanently of mildew, cheap cigarettes, and rotting wood. The roof leaked heavily during rainstorms, forcing them to place dirty plastic buckets across the warped linoleum floor just to keep their shoes dry. The thin metal walls offered absolutely no protection from the biting winter wind or the terrifying sounds of the neighborhood. Instead of waking up to the gentle melodies of a private string quartet, they were jolted awake every single night by the blaring sirens of police cruisers and the aggressive shouting of violent neighbors outside their thin door. There were no valets, no personal chefs, and no imported champagne. There was only the brutal, exhausting, terrifying reality of minimum wage survival in a city that no longer cared if they lived or died. To pay their weekly rent and avoid sleeping on the actual concrete streets, Richard and Patricia were forced to accept the absolute lowest tier of menial labor available. Richard, the man who used to terrorize corporate boardrooms and demand absolute submission from everyone around him, was hired as a grocery bagger at a massive discount supermarket. The towering, arrogant patriarch was forced to wear a cheap, brightly colored nylon vest over his faded thrift store clothing. He spent 8 grueling hours a day standing on the hard concrete floor, his aging knees screaming in agonizing pain with every single step. He had to bow his head and respectfully bag canned goods for the very same working-class citizens he had aggressively despised his entire life. Customers would snap their fingers at him, loudly demanding he double-bag their heavy items, treating him with the exact same dismissive contempt he had once shown to me. Every single time he had to force a polite, subservient smile and apologize to a rude customer, a massive piece of his fragile, inflated ego shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He was a broken man earning pennies to survive. Patricia suffered an equally devastating dose of poetic justice. The elite socialite who previously spent her afternoons attending exclusive charity galas and enjoying $1,000 spa treatments was now working the graveyard shift as a commercial janitor. She spent her nights inside a towering corporate office building, wearing a stained, oversized gray uniform that hung awkwardly on her frame. She was forced to push a heavy yellow mop bucket down miles of empty, echoing corridors. She spent hours scrubbing filthy toilets, scraping dried gum off the floors, and hauling massive dripping bags of rotting garbage down to the industrial dumpsters in the freezing alleyway. The harsh, toxic cleaning chemicals completely destroyed her hands. Her skin, once kept flawlessly soft by expensive imported lotions, was now deeply cracked, calloused, and constantly bleeding. Her manicured fingernails were chipped and permanently stained with dirt. She spent her nights scrubbing the pristine marble floors of the exact type of executive corporate offices she used to arrogantly strut through. It was the ultimate crushing irony. They were completely drowning in the exact same manual labor they had repeatedly accused me of doing. The universe was forcing them to live the exact nightmare they had desperately tried to assign to me. One freezing Tuesday evening, after finishing their exhausting, back-breaking shifts, Richard and Patricia sat at their wobbly plastic dining table inside the freezing trailer. They were silently eating cold, generic canned soup directly from the tin because they could not afford to pay their gas bill to heat the stove. Patricia reached over with her bandaged hands and turned the dial on a tiny, battered television set they had scavenged from a local thrift store. The screen flickered with heavy static before the evening news broadcast finally stabilized. The local anchor was delivering a segment on federal law enforcement. Suddenly, a crisp, high-definition photograph of my face flashed across the screen. I was standing at a podium in Washington, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored federal suit, looking completely composed and immensely powerful. The anchor enthusiastically detailed my recent, highly publicized promotion at the Department of the Treasury. The news report highlighted my groundbreaking, heavily praised work in systematically dismantling a massive international financial syndicate. The broadcast praised my brilliant undercover tactics and my flawless execution of federal justice, explicitly naming me as one of the most effective task force leaders in the entire country. Richard dropped his plastic spoon. It clattered loudly against the table as he stared at the screen in absolute horrified disbelief. Patricia stopped chewing her cold food. The bitter, agonizing reality of their catastrophic failure finally broke her completely. The daughter they had thrown away, the woman they had labeled a pathetic, worthless disappointment, was now a celebrated, high-ranking federal authority figure commanding national respect. Patricia let out a desperate, guttural sob that tore through the small trailer. Her hands shook violently as she frantically began tearing through a pile of past-due bills and junk mail on the kitchen counter. She scavenged a crumpled, torn piece of lined paper and a cheap, leaking ballpoint pen. Driven by sheer pathetic desperation and the crushing weight of her own poverty, she sat down at the plastic table. With tears streaming down her dirty face, she began to rapidly write a begging letter to the powerful daughter she had completely destroyed. Miles away from the bleak and rotting reality of that forgotten trailer park, I sat comfortably behind a massive mahogany desk, bathed in the brilliant, warm morning sunlight. The study of Grandfather Harrison's $15 million estate had been completely transformed since the day the federal agents raided the property. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that my parents had always forced upon this beautiful house was entirely eradicated. I had ordered the removal of their gaudy, status-obsessed decorations the very same week the federal asset forfeiture was finalized. In their place, I brought in clean, modern furnishings that breathed genuine life and purpose back into the sprawling architecture. The estate was no longer a hollow monument to extreme suburban greed. It was now the official, bustling headquarters of the Harrison Legal Aid Foundation. I had taken the massive fortune my grandfather deliberately entrusted to me and built a fortress designed specifically to protect the vulnerable. We employed a dedicated team of top-tier financial analysts, aggressive civil litigators, and seasoned forensic accountants. Our entire organizational mission was strictly focused on dismantling cases of familial financial abuse and aggressively prosecuting predators who targeted the elderly. Every single day, We took on complex legal battles for victims whose own flesh and blood had tried to exploit them. We froze fraudulent bank accounts, reversed stolen property deeds, and worked directly alongside the Department of the Treasury to ensure perpetrators faced maximum federal sentencing. My grandfather wanted his wealth to mean something real. Looking out through the massive bay windows at the manicured lawns where my legal staff was currently hosting a charity breakfast, I knew I had successfully honored his final brilliant request. The heavy oak door to my study opened quietly. My executive assistant, a highly efficient former paralegal named David, stepped into the sunlit room, carrying a stacked silver tray of the morning correspondence. He placed the tray carefully on the edge of my polished desk. David handed me a secure tablet containing the updated court dockets for our current active fraud cases, then gestured toward the physical mail. We received the standard influx of foundation donations and federal correspondence this morning, David reported in his usual crisp, professional tone. The Attorney General office sent over the finalized indictments for the nursing home embezzlement case we flagged last month. The subpoenas are ready for your signature. There is also a substantial envelope from the primary donor network in Chicago. However, there is one particular piece of mail that did not make it past the initial security screening without raising a flag. I thought you should inspect it personally before I dispose of it. I thanked David, signed the necessary federal subpoenas, and turned my attention to the silver tray. Among the pristine, heavy stock white envelopes bearing prestigious law firm letterheads and official government seals, one specific item stood out like a grotesque anomaly. It was a cheap, flimsy, heavily wrinkled envelope. The paper was severely water-damaged in one corner, stained with something that looked suspiciously like dirty grease. The postage stamp was taped on crookedly. The handwriting scrawled across the front was frantic, jagged, and aggressively pressed into the cheap paper. I reached out and picked up the envelope. The paper felt gritty and utterly disgusting against my clean fingers. I immediately recognized the erratic, looping cursive handwriting. It belonged to Patricia. I flipped the envelope over and inspected the return address. It listed a designated lot number at the Sunnyside Mobile Home Park, a notorious crime-ridden stretch of industrial wasteland located on the absolute outer fringes of the county limit. The very sight of that desperate, pathetic return address confirmed everything the federal asset forfeiture reports had detailed. My parents had truly hit rock bottom. I slid a sleek metal letter opener beneath the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of torn yellow-lined notebook paper. The ink was heavily smudged, likely from the exact tears of manufactured desperation Patricia had weaponized against me my entire life. I unfolded the crumpled page and began to read the frantic, pathetic words of a woman who had completely lost her mind along with her stolen fortune. The letter was a masterpiece of classic unhinged manipulation. Patricia did not start by apologizing for stealing my college fund, nor did she express any genuine remorse for participating in a federal money laundering syndicate that nearly destroyed my life. Instead, she immediately launched into a frantic, detailed description of her current physical suffering. She wrote extensively about how her hands were bleeding from scrubbing toxic corporate floors. She complained that Richard was coughing constantly due to the black mold growing inside the walls of their freezing trailer. She vividly described the terror of hearing gunshots outside their thin metal door every single night. Then the inevitable pivot occurred. After desperately trying to elicit my deepest sympathies, Patricia unleashed the heavy guilt trip. She wrote that they were still my parents, my flesh and blood, and that it was a fundamental sin against God to let the people who gave me life starve in the dirt. She begged for a second chance. She pleaded for me to wire just $10,000 to a prepaid debit card, promising they would use the money to rent a safe apartment and finally become the loving parents I had always wanted. She ended the letter by insisting that holding on to a grudge was poisoning my soul and that true healing could only come by forgiving my family and sharing my massive wealth with them in their darkest hour of desperate need. I finished reading the frantic, rambling signature at the bottom of the page. I gently placed the filthy piece of paper flat against the pristine, polished mahogany surface of my desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and simply stared at the crumpled letter. A profound, deafening silence settled over the sunlit study. If this exact letter had arrived on my doorstep a year ago, my reaction would have been entirely different. A year ago, I was still conditioned to respond to their manipulative tactics. I would have felt a sudden sharp twinge of deep, agonizing guilt. I would have agonized over their physical suffering, questioning whether I was being too harsh or too vindictive. My mind would have frantically tried to justify sending them a small sum of money, desperate to buy the maternal love and paternal approval they constantly dangled just out of my reach. I would have lost sleep over the thought of my father bagging groceries and my mother scrubbing toilets on her hands and knees. But I was no longer that terrified, compliant auditor, desperately seeking validation from abusers. I had completely shed that skin the exact moment the heavy steel handcuffs had locked around my wrists in my apartment. I sat in the warm sunlight of my new empire, holding the ultimate proof of my parents' absolute destruction, and I waited for the guilt to arrive. I waited for the familiar sting of familial obligation to strike my chest. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sadness. There was no pity. There was no lingering desire to save them from the consequences of their own horrific criminal actions. The emotional void inside me was total, absolute, and incredibly liberating. My parents were completely dead to me, and their pathetic cries for help from the bottom of the gutter registered as nothing more than meaningless white noise. I reached forward, picking the dirty, crumpled letter up from the desk. The greasy paper felt heavy, loaded with decades of emotional manipulation and highly toxic expectations. In the past, I would have folded it carefully, tucked it away in a secret drawer, and agonized over every single word for weeks. I would have questioned my own sanity, wondering if I was truly the villain they constantly painted me out to be. I would have let their manufactured misery completely consume my hard-earned peace. I would have drafted a dozen different replies, trying to find the perfect combination of words to somehow fix the unfixable. But not today, not ever again. I held the letter by its frayed edge, carrying it across the spacious office toward the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting discreetly in the corner of the room. I reached out and turned the machine on. The powerful motor roared to life with a deep, satisfying hum, a mechanical beast waiting to be fed. Without a single second of hesitation, I fed the pages directly into the narrow slot. The sharp steel blades instantly caught the cheap paper, violently pulling it downward with a sharp grinding noise. I watched with absolute emotional detachment as Patricia's desperate pleas, her frantic apologies, and her pathetic demands for my money were methodically sliced into thousands of tiny, completely illegible shreds. The machine rapidly chewed through the final paragraph, aggressively destroying the signature of the woman who had happily tried to sell my future to a criminal. I dropped the water-damaged envelope in right after it. The blades ground the remaining evidence of my abusive past into meaningless confetti, mixing it with the discarded drafts of standard legal forms. I pressed the button to power down the shredder. The heavy motor spun to a halt, and the room fell back into a comfortable, secure silence. The past was permanently destroyed, leaving absolutely no trace behind. I walked over to the small beverage station resting on a polished credenza near the tall bookshelf. I picked up my porcelain mug, the smooth ceramic surface radiating a comforting heat against my palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast coffee. The rich, bold flavor grounded me perfectly in the present moment, a stark contrast to the cold, bitter soup my parents were currently enduring. Carrying the warm mug, I moved toward the massive bay windows that lined the southern wall of my study. I looked out over the beautiful, peaceful grounds of the Harrison estate. The morning fog had completely burned off by now, revealing a vibrant, flawless blue sky. The ancient oak trees cast long, protective shadows across the perfectly manicured green lawns. In the distance near the stone fountain, several members of my legal team were seated around a wrought iron patio table. They were enjoying a catered breakfast, reviewing thick case files and passionately discussing new strategies to dismantle fraudulent corporate entities. They were brilliant, dedicated professionals, who shared my exact vision for a just world. They were the community I had deliberately chosen to build from the ground up. The estate was absolutely thriving, successfully transformed from a hollow monument of suburban greed into a powerful active sanctuary for true justice. Looking at the peaceful scene unfolding outside my window, a profound realization washed over me, solidifying everything I had learned over the past year. Society constantly feeds us the dangerous, pervasive narrative that we must always forgive our parents no matter what terrible things they do. We are repeatedly told that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable bond, and that we must endlessly tolerate profound abuse under the guise of familial duty. But those platitudes are nothing more than toxic traps designed to keep victims locked in a perpetual cycle of control and manipulation. People who demand blind loyalty solely based on shared DNA are usually the ones who need that blind loyalty to cover up their own horrific behavior. Family is not blood. Blood is merely a biological coincidence. Blood simply makes you related to someone by pure chance. True family is built on a solid foundation of absolute loyalty, unwavering respect, and fierce mutual protection. Family consists of the people who stand by you when you are struggling, not the ones who deliberately push you down the stairs and then eagerly demand you apologize for bleeding on their expensive shoes. My parents and my sister never viewed me as family. They viewed me as a convenient asset to be exploited, a silent scapegoat, to carry their shame, and an easy target for their endless insecurities. They were a highly infectious disease that had actively poisoned my life for 33 years. When a limb turns gangrenous, you do not sit down and try to negotiate with the infection. You do not wrap a clean bandage around the rotting flesh, pretend the agonizing pain is just a normal phase of life, and hope the deadly bacteria will miraculously decide to stop spreading. You take a surgical blade and you completely cut it off to save your life. You sever the dead weight so the rest of your body can finally survive and heal properly. Severing ties with Richard, Patricia, and Brittany was the ultimate amputation. It was a painful, terrifying, and brutal procedure, but it entirely cured the sickness that was aggressively destroying my future. I was no longer infected by their overwhelming greed. I was no longer paralyzed by their constant suffocating judgment. I was completely, wonderfully free. I took one final lingering look at the gorgeous estate grounds, letting the profound sense of security fill my chest. Then I turned away from the window and walked purposefully back to my heavy mahogany desk. I set my coffee mug down next to the silver tray. I reached out and picked up the thick, highly classified federal case file that my assistant had dropped off earlier that morning. I opened the heavy manila folder, my eyes scanning the dense text of the preliminary briefing. It detailed a massive, highly sophisticated elder fraud ring currently operating out of a major metropolitan nursing home network. Wealthy, arrogant predators were systematically draining the life savings of vulnerable citizens. They thought they were completely untouchable behind their shell corporations. They thought no one was watching them operate in the dark. They were about to learn a very painful, devastating lesson about federal jurisdiction. I reached for my favorite pen, my mind instantly shifting into sharp, calculating focus. I had a new mission to execute, a new criminal syndicate to aggressively dismantle, and a new group of innocent victims who desperately needed my protection. I pulled the first official subpoena toward me and firmly signed my name on the bottom line. Have you ever had to sever ties with toxic blood to save your own life? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, never let anyone convince you that abuse is just family dynamics. The story of Clara serves as a powerful testament to one of the hardest and most liberating truths a human being can learn. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Society constantly conditions us to believe that familial bonds are sacred and unbreakable, telling us that we are morally obligated to unconditionally forgive those who share our DNA. However, this ingrained narrative is frequently weaponized by toxic individuals to maintain their control and avoid any accountability for their abuse. Clara makes the ultimate realization that true family must be built on a steadfast foundation of unwavering respect, absolute loyalty, and mutual protection. When the very people who are supposed to nurture you become the predators you desperately need protection from, the concept of blind familial duty transforms into a dangerous and suffocating trap. Her empowering decision to shred her mother, corrupted letter rather than succumbing to manufactured guilt, illustrates a profound act of radical self-preservation. She teaches us that walking away from abusers is not an act of cruelty, selfishness, or betrayal. Rather, it is a deeply necessary emotional amputation. Just as a surgeon must sever a decaying limb to save the rest of the body, we must possess the bravery to cut off toxic relationships to preserve our own mental, financial, and emotional survival. We are never obligated to set ourselves on fire simply to keep our abusive relatives warm. By firmly rejecting the crushing burden of toxic expectations, we create the necessary space to build a chosen family, a vibrant community of people who genuinely value respect and uplift us. Taking back our power means redefining success and love entirely on our own terms. Evaluate the relationships in your own life today and find the courage to sever the ties that are quietly destroying your peace.